Welcome to the Touching into Presence podcast.
This podcast is for people who are interested in bodywork, empowerment, and somatic-based practices.
I am Nikki Olson.
I'm Andrew Rosenstock.
We are certified Rolfers.
Collectively, we're trained in various movement and bodywork therapies with an emphasis on somatic awareness and client resilience.
Through conversations, our goal is to share and explore mind-body paradigms to offer empowerment possibilities.
We're grateful to be in conversation with Dr. Biko Mandela Gray. Dr. Gray's work operates at the nexus and interplay between continental philosophy of religion and theories and methods in African American religion. His research is primarily on the connection between race, subjectivity, religion, and embodiment, exploring how these four categories play on one another in the concrete space of human experience. He is also interested in the religious implications of social justice movements. He's currently working on a book project that explores how contemporary racial justice movements, like Blacklivesmatter, demonstrates new ways of theorizing the connection between embodiment, religion, and subjectivity. Today's talk, we open a conversation into a why is bodywork largely a by-white, for-white practice. Dr. Gray shares some historical and philosophical reasons why he believes this may be the case. Really, we dive into so much that it just really needs to be listened to. There's a ton to unpack from this one, and we're happy to share this for yours and the world's benefit. So with that, let's begin the talk. Hey,
Hi.
Biko.
It is good to see you all. I'm here for you all for, I guess, about an hour or so.
Cool. Basically, I heard you on the SLM podcast. It was what I was wanting to hear because I was hearing so much that didn't resonate with me in a lot of ways. And not just because I am white, and clearly I am white, in case this isn't the reflection coming off, I am opaque. But there was something in the rhetoric that wasn't what I wasn't connecting with. And then when I heard you speak, I was like, oh yeah, this makes sense. And it's very similar with like John McWhorter. I don't know if you know who John McWhorter is. And I feel like it's probably the fact that you guys both are have philosophy backgrounds. That I think that there's something about being able to think greater than most of our guests have actually been white, and most of our listeners are white because the bodywork is a relatively for white by white, and we don't think it should be, and we want to find how do we make it inclusive. And I just spoke entirely for Nikki, so I can actually let her say something.
No, I'm just really thrilled to learn and to hear what you have to say. And has been a big question in our work, especially in light of Black Lives Matters and how even with where our political world is right now, how there's all this division. And it's been easy, maybe from a white perspective, to just kind of go along with like, well, this is what I do. This is how I live my life. And, but realizing that if we really are being authentic and want equality, then we have to be asking questions of how do we get more involved, and also curious of maybe why isn't our body work more diverse with different races. I think sometimes with religion, we might have a little bit more diversity, but definitely not with race.
I'll say a couple things. So I want you all to know at the beginning, my resting face just looks angry. I'm actually usually not angry. I'm just listening to you all. So that's the first thing. You will be able to tell very clearly when I'm frustrated. But my resting face just is serious. It's not negative. I will say a couple of things. One, I don't know why body work is not something that is, I can't answer that question. I can't explain it for you. What I can provide just to get the conversation started is that bodywork seems to be a novelty for white people because white people have never had to grapple with the reality of their body, the materiality of their body in ways that particularly Black folks have had to since our arrival here in the West and specifically in the United States. I say that to say there's a few scholars who say this, and it's a little work that I've been doing philosophically, is that we have always been reduced to our bodies. Right. And so in other words, we are nothing more than our bodies. We are nothing more than these organs that are essentially siphoned for profit. And so when you have that kind of relationship, or that historical or genealogical relationship to your flesh, to your body, it becomes difficult. It becomes difficult to find different ways to relate to this thing. That doesn't mean that people don't relate to their bodies in incredible ways. Black people have, of course, done hip hop. We have danced, we have sung, we have done all of those things. We have run, we have played sports, we have taught classes, we have preached, we have done all of these interesting cultural productions and produced some incredible things on the basis of these things that we call bodies. The problem, though, is that more often than not, that's where the conversation begins and ends, specifically for Black people. And I'm not talking at like a subjective, like feelings level. I'm talking at an analytic, historical level, right? So if Catherine McKittrick, who's a scholar in Canada, she says that actually Blackness enters the modernity, like Black people enter modernity through the ledger. Right, through the counting and commodification of bodies. And what this ultimately does is that Blackness enters the conversation in the West, a conversation in the West that's structured by freedom, democracy, equality, and opportunity. Blackness enters that conversation by way of ledgers and insurance contracts and essentially property relations. So all of the freedom, the justice, the democracy, that is all propped up by the commodification of what we like to call Black bodies. I say that to say that, like, for me, and I hope I'm making sense, I say that to say, for me, that's something that has been really, really difficult for me in recent times. So what I was going to say is, so there's this artist, Beyonce's little sister, or actually Solange is actually Beyonce's younger. Yes, so Solange is Beyonce's younger sister, and she wrote a song called "Weary." And one of the lines in the song is, "I'm weary with the weight of the world." And the bridge goes, "I'm going to go look for my body. I'll be back real soon." And what happens is on the one hand, we're reduced to our bodies. This is why, for example, Tamir Rice is described as being 5'8" and 185 pounds, because it doesn't really matter how old he was. He was 12. But if you say 5'8", 185, you're describing a body that's large enough to be threatening. So it didn't matter how old he was. You've just reduced him to his body. And so what happens in these moments is we lose access to our bodies when we go through these moments, or at least I do. I get incredibly anxious and have to go find myself, have to reground myself in this thing. But where can I go? That becomes the question. Where do I go for a kind of refuge, a kind of grounding? How do I find that? I don't, and all I can tell you is that is incredibly difficult work to do. So that's the sort of intro, like, and I don't want to say intro in the sense of like rudimentary, but that's like where I enter this conversation about Blackness and embodiment, is that we've never really had access to our bodies in a way, not politically anyway. We haven't had access to our bodies in a way that allows for us to do the kind of body work that it sounds like many folks like yourselves are doing.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I love the fact that you said that's the intro, because I feel like I could take a few days just to kind of sit with that and compound it. To some extent, it's like, oh yeah, that's so obvious. And to some extent, it's like, why? And this is what for me, where I've been a lot in this Black Lives Matter, all this sort of thing, is like, oh shit, I never thought of it that way before. I never had to. I'm white. I grew up Jewish. I would say, okay, there's a slight difference there, but that's just maybe me trying to fit in. I lived some time in the Caribbean. Okay, that's still me trying to, like, oh, I can understand. No, I can't. Especially that ledger, that really sunk into me in such a way that is, again, so obvious, but shit, I never even thought of it that way. I don't usually cuss on the podcast, so now people are hearing how I really speak. And so it's interesting, because you were saying, like, yeah, you don't necessarily know where to go or how to go. And that's maybe because my nature is to be a problem solver. It's like, okay, well, we have this issue. How do we go? And so part of it I'm hearing is, if you don't know where you can go to find that, to have that space of calm, of embodiment in your own life, there I don't want to say there should be. I don't like the word should, but I use it all the time. But there should be a way where all people have access to safety, to feeling in their body not being a ledger, their body not being I'm thinking of like the athletics where it's like that their body, they're not their mind. They're how well can they run? How well can they shoot? How much money can they win for us? There should be ways where things are. And if there isn't, well, now's a sure as hell good time to start getting it out there. My background's in meditation a lot as well as body work. And I've seen in the yoga community a lot of wonderful things coming out for Black, by Black, or BIPOC as well stuff. While also a lot of that struggling with a way of, if we're creating more separation, aren't we creating more separation? And still trying to struggle within that. How do we have spaces? I heard a teacher the other night who's the president of the Black Yoga Alliance, and I left that saying, okay, I want to be a member. Clearly, I can't because I'm white, but I want to be an ally, or whatever that word means. I want to find ways that to support these people, even though it's not about me, just to support, to provide places. I know that's one sort of place. I don't know. How do you see starting to build this dialogue? How to get people knowing this?
I think you have to start. I appreciate your vulnerability and your honesty here. A couple of things. I don't see it so much as separation. I don't see the separation so much as honesty. I think there's a particular way that, and I don't even think of it as like different experiences so much as different receptions and different framing. So I'll give you a good example of this. Breonna Taylor, I'm sure you all have been following this at this point. Breonna Taylor was, brutally killed in her own home. And we got the ruling a couple of weeks ago where people where all of a sudden what we notice in the midst of that conversation, and I'm going somewhere with this, so just hop in the car and ride with me. What we noticed in that ruling was ultimately that the crime actually wasn't killing her. I'm going to say that one more time. The crime was actually missing her. Like, the crime was because the officers had bad aim and didn't hit the body they intended to hit. So when the AG, who happens to be a Black guy, which is one thing that we can talk about all day, but my point here is that the Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, makes it very clear, and he's absolutely right about this, justice has been served. One of the things that makes it so difficult to have these conversations and to do this work is that I resonate so deeply when you say there should be spaces for us to have refuge. And yet I live in a world where what it means for me to have refuge would actually entail the entire dissolution of the status quo as it stands right now. So on the one hand, yes, let's find those places of refuge. Let's find those openings of connection, of groundedness, of solidity. I do a bit of meditation myself, and those are the moments where I do find grounding. And yet in some of my more tumultuous moments, my body reminds me that if I step outside, 6'1", 240 plus pounds with long locks on my head, that I am immediately going to be understood, not as a professor of religion at a top 50 university, but instead understood as a threatening body. The very thing that grounds me is also the very thing that could kill me, and is also the very thing that could justify my demise. And so I the only thing that I can say is that I don't know. I think the starting point is us first realizing that what happened with Breonna Taylor and what happened with George Floyd's killer, Derek Chauvin, being out on bail, that's what the country thinks should happen. Cops are doing their jobs and they're being rewarded for doing their jobs. And so if we don't start there, it becomes difficult to think about how we can find other possibilities. Because if we're not honest with ourselves about, this is what we want, right? As a country, this is what we continually want. This is what we need. This is what we desire. If we don't start there, I don't know how we find other possibilities of connection, of the kinds of connections that you're naming, the kinds of possibilities and opportunities for grounding, for community, for sociality that you're naming and you're yearning for. So I think that's one of the hardest lessons for white people to understand, right? That like, especially white people who want to do what we might call accomplice work or ally work, is that they want to maintain, and this is not about you all specifically, this is just a sort of a general thing. They want to change the world, but they don't want to change the world, if that makes sense, right? They want to change the world, but a discourse on defunding or abolishing the police becomes a bridge too far. Well, we've tried everything else. Officers have huge technological mechanisms for accountability, and yet we are still gunned down at first sight. We are still reduced to the bodies that need the work that you all are pushing for. And so I think that's my way of sort of just hopping in and saying, I'm with you. I think the starting point for us is a profound and not just sort of intellectual or rhetorical assent to this claim, but a profound recognition that what happens to me if I'm killed, what happened to Breonna Taylor, what happened to Terrence Crutcher, what happened to Botham Jean, Tamir Rice, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Mike Brown, Alton Sterling, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, like what happened to all of these folks, Rekia Boyd, Sandra Bland, the Charleston Nine, that's what's supposed to happen. And if we start there, then we can have another conversation about, well, how do we completely shift those norms so that we can begin to say, you know what? Nah, Andrew's absolutely right. This shouldn't happen, but what does a world look like where everyone recognizes that it should not happen that way? I know that was a lot, but that was my way of trying to sort of like provide a thick response to this constructive question that you're asking. I appreciate you not asking well, what do we do? I don't know the answer to that question. So yeah, but I do know that that's my way of saying, okay, can we at the very least, the philosopher in me, the teacher in me, can we at the very least lean into that what's happening in this world is what's supposed to happen? If we can start there, then we can realize, oh no, the cops are actually pretty terrible as an institution, right? If we start from the idea that they're doing their jobs, then we can go back and say, well, what does it mean that we applaud them for doing that thing that's killing all of these folks? And then what are the constructive possibilities there? And what are the constructive possibilities for those of us like yourselves who are doing the contemplative meditative work?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, so many people had to die for the world, white people, everybody, to start recognizing, like, wait a minute, this is out of hand. And I think the difference, I know for myself, instead of just being like, oh, that's terrible news, being like, okay, wait a minute, and it's been interesting for me because I definitely am like the person who's like, how do I say this? I never really thought about people like racist ideas. I've dated a rainbow of people. So in my innate consciousness, it just wasn't there. But then what's been different for me in the recent times was being like, wait a minute, saying racist that's not good enough. Like really, really stepping into where are my privileges just by being born white. And of course, I can kind of play into like, well, I'm a woman and, haven't gotten the same rights as, men, but it's definitely been interesting kind of sitting here and thinking into recognizing, yeah, me, a white woman and a Black woman could walk into the same grocery store and that the Black woman might be judged, being like, well, suspicious of what she's doing, where not so much me. And really embodying that and being like, okay, how do we start not accepting that anymore? And I think probably having conversations. And when we first started talking, and you were talking about how Black people have had dance and folk music, hip hop, how their experience, their historical experience has brought so much beautiful art. And maybe maybe the white people need to get the body work because we don't have that expression as much as like, I mean, I have a funny story about, I used to live in New York City and I love movement. I love dance. And I wanted to take up African dance. And I walked into this studio and I am the only white person and trying to move my hips and to find that rhythm. And those ladies had so much patience with me. And I ended up, I didn't feel comfortable there. So it's just interesting. As much as I tried, I just could not get that groove where
I think, I mean, I would say a few things. I think one is that, you know, on the one hand, you are not, there's a distinction between, in my mind, placing fault and taking responsibility. So I'll start there with the series of comments that you've just given, Nikki. I think the first thing I'll say is that it is by no fault of your own that your understanding of what constitutes racism or anti-Blackness is limited to people's interpersonal mental states and motivations, right? That is actually a profound dimension of anti-Blackness in the West, is to understand racism as limited to people's particular motivations or even specific words that they say. And so one of the things that I just finished this, or I'm finishing up this manuscript, for this book. And one of the things I try to make clear in the first chapter is that two officers who killed two children, Joseph Weekley killed Ayanna Stanley Jones. I believe she was 9 years old when she died, or 7. I can't remember. 7. She was 7 when she died. He walked in her house and turned to the side. She was sleeping on the couch. He walked in the door. The couch is right next to the door. He turned to the right, shot her once in the head. She died immediately. Timothy Loman killed Tamir Rice within 2 seconds of the car stopping and arriving on the scene. Tamir Rice is playing with a BB gun. The orange cap had fallen off. And the cop, Timothy Loman, shoots before questions are asked. And one of the things that I try to do in this chapter is I try to sit with like thoughtlessness, right? Not necessarily intentions. Neither Timothy Loman nor Joseph Weekley would ever say that they're racist, right? Neither one of them would ever lay claim to being, you know what, I'm racist. And Darren Wilson would claim that he wasn't racist, right? And he shot Mike Brown 8 times, right? I mean, Alton Sterling, Blaine Salamone, who shot Alton Sterling 6 times, would say that he's not racist. The current president would say that he's not racist. All of these particular folks would lay claim to this. And they, in many ways, with the exception of our contemporary president, probably would be telling the truth to the best of their abilities. They do not think themselves racist. And so these are just unfortunate incidents, right? Just unfortunate tragedies that have occurred. One thing that I try to do, not necessarily in the text, but one thing I'll share with you is that in my classes, I show folks a red octagon, just a red octagon, right? And so I'd ask folks, I've actually done this with police officers, like, what is this? And they're like, a stop sign. And then I show them a stop sign, which is a red octagon with the word stop on it. And I say, well, what is that? And they say, oh, that's a stop sign. I said, but you notice the other thing that is a red octagon, and you claimed that it was a stop sign. And I asked the next question, would you stop if you saw that red octagon placed on the side of a road, just sitting up there? And they said, of course we would. And I said, but that's not a stop sign. You would have misperceived, and that would have been unintentional. You would have stopped for no reason, right? But that's because we've been structured to stop at red octagons. And so we have been structured to misperceive a red octagon for being a stop sign. The structure of misperception is something that exceeds intention. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that racism actually is rarely an intentional act. Anti-Blackness is rarely intentional. This is why the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo, all those folks are getting so much play, because they're the extreme of it. The more pernicious form is the Democratic Party playing to the middle, because they want to win a political game, and they have to. Black people aren't going to get them in the White House. And so what do? They appeal to middle range interest and assume Black votes. I say all that to say that no one is intentionally racist. And so I don't place fault on you or anyone else for that. I do think at that point that you realize things, everyone else realize, though, responsibility. Like how do I then take responsibility for the things that I know? I would say that this comes with, and you were mentioning the dance thing, this actually transitions me into that very well, that paying attention to the kind of patience the kind of invitation that Blackness offers, even in the midst of impossibly difficult circumstances. Those Black women were patient with you because that's and it's not an essential trait. It's just, I've never known Black women to not be that patient with folks before. The other part about it is that Blackness is not inherently rhythmic. I have no rhythm at all, but I do none. My partner tells me all the time, she's like, baby, you always off rhythm. But my body's always moving too. And part of it is that even if I don't have rhythm, in Black studies, we have this concept called fugitivity. It means that ultimately Blackness is always moving, and that Black flesh is always moving. And sometimes it moves to a rhythm. Sometimes it doesn't, like in the case of someone like myself. Sometimes it moves fluidly on basketball courts, or sometimes it moves fluidly on presidential podiums, or sometimes it moves fluidly within the context of different mediums. And so I say all that to say that part of what you might have experienced, or at least what I've experienced when I've tried to dance, is the power of Blackness as movement. And this is why when we talk about Black Lives Matter, I'm much more interested in Black Lives Matter as a movement, as the movement for Black lives. That it's not simply the static corpse that is produced in the street by a state-sanctioned officer. It is also the movement of flesh that marches and screams and chants. And in those streets, in those places, there's a choreography that's already operative, one that is not limited just to people who happen to be Black. And so I just say all of that to say that you experience the joy of a different kind of body work in my mind, the kind of body work that doesn't know how to name itself as body work, and we might actually call it flesh work. And I could talk about what that means, but right now I just wanted to both affirm and let you know, like, yeah, like racism exceeds your intentions. We fall into it all the time.
I love that analogy that you were saying, how movement flows within the body. I mean, in some ways, I know we're kind of talking about how do we honor the Black Lives Movement, but at the same time, I just kept on having this image of, like, in the support of the movement, then then all races are moving together. I mean, you're kind of talking about the body and its birthright to be able to move and to flow. I mean, embryology, I mean, kind of, in the genetic code that's going to figure out its color of its skin. But when the two cells come together, it is this kind of pulsing, rhythmic flow. The body is first experience is movement.
I have so much to say. I would say that I rarely, so a friend of mine who actually it was actually at Esalen, he invited me to Esalen the first time. His name's Stephen Finley. He and I have multiple phone conversations, and one of the things that we have been thinking about is that the movement that you're talking about, something that exceeds the particularity of people who fall under the sign Black, and I'm saying it that way specifically, like people who fall under that sign. One of the things that you notice is that Blackness exceeds the racial category that it is constrained to. So if you look out into the sky at the middle of the night, you notice that Blackness actually conditions the universe. That actually it is darkness that actually conditions movement. I'm only bringing that up to say that the very movement that you're discussing, the very movement that you're articulating that exceeds the people who we call Black is actually a condition for everyone. That Blackness is a condition, that Blackness conditions all movement. And we call it metaphysical Blackness, but that's a philosophical term. I don't mean it in the like, ooh, let's ascend to the higher heights and I actually mean that it is a principle of being, that Blackness is the principle of existence, that it's not necessarily racialized, but when it becomes racialized, it becomes a problem. And when it becomes a problem, people want to solve that problem. And usually that involves killing it. So I just wanted, again, just affirm you and say, yes, like in the grand scheme of things, you're absolutely right that embryos come together and that babies, children, infants, small animals are formed in the darkness, right? This is the one thing that even religious traditions point toward, is that darkness conditions our possibilities. Blackness conditions our movement in our life. But we don't read it that way. We don't think of the myths in this way. So the cosmogonies don't register like this until you actually think about it. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, blackness is something that is disruptive and generative and wonderful and moving and joyous and scary and terrifying and filled with pain and suffering and sorrow and all of those things. So yes to the movement. I see that movement is always and already Black for multiple reasons.
Just to make sure we're on the same page, and there's, again, so much to just unpack there. I'm just thinking of like Judeo-Christian upbringings. The Aramaic people would have been people thousands of years before. The first chapter of the Bible is God created light. So everything before that would have been darkness before. That's somewhat what you're saying, right? I mean, I know that's only a small part of it, but like
that's precisely it.
Yeah, I'm a little bit, I usually talk more. There's just a lot to take in. Thankfully.
I'm rambling, but it's because,
no, I love it. I love it.
Y'all are saying different things. If you don't mind, I'll hop in here and say just very briefly, certain translations of the Hebrew Bible of the Torah actually translate that first. So in the West, and this is why I say anti-Blackness or racism exceeds intention. In the West, we read that scripture as, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? And the Spirit of the Lord, and dark was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the waters, right? And so all of a sudden God says, let there be light, and all of a sudden wonderful things happen. The actual Hebrew translation of it is when God began to create the earth. So in other words, darkness was always part of God. And what we do in the West is we actually assume what's contradictory to what you just said, Andrew, which is at the end of the day, actually darkness has always been part of divinity. Blackness has always been part of the conversation of the divine. Blackness conditions life. But we have sought, and you hear us do this all the time in our conversations in Vernet. Well, I'm going to a dark place. Or, whoo, that was a dark movie. Talking about, I don't know, like Saw. I don't know if y'all watched the Saw movies when they first came out. They were horrifying for me. I don't know if they were for you. But even if you watch those movies, right? The aesthetic for the movies, there's a dark filter over the lenses. Everything's creepy and such that we are trained to fear darkness. It's part of the mythical construct and eventually becomes part of our social psychology. It becomes an archetype for us, right? This is why this is why when we think of criminals, it's not simply that we think of Black folks. We think of criminals as Black because we think of criminality and evil as darkness. Does that make sense? So there's this.
It makes sense. I remember having similar thoughts, trying to parse this together, not with people, but seeing this years ago, having this sort of, why are things that are quote unquote bad of the darker shade, and things that are like, oh, I need to lighten up. I need to feel like things that are good or light. Even what is the sign? Like if you go into a lot of these pseudo spiritual cults, I'll just get in trouble for that one. What do they wear? They wear all white, right? They wear all white. It's the absence of anything, which I would actually say the absence of anything is kind of boring. And actually there's no life in there because there's an absence. But there is that opposite of white is good, Black is bad. There is a culture. It's not even cultural. It exceeds cultures. I say this a lot. I'm going to get in trouble for this again, too. The word for Africa and China. So China is a completely different culture. The word for Africa is Feijiao, which literally translates into backwards country, reverse country, because people are Black there. It's a reverse. This is like, if there's Chinese scholars, I know you're going to yell at me for this and you're going to say, no, it's not that, but just look at the words. So it's not just a cultural thing. There is this greater thing and I don't know where that started from. And I don't really care to some extent, although I realize if you want to change something, you have to find the roots. But I am more concerned with how do you change the dialogue? How do you make it so I love the idea of equality. I don't see equality ever being a real thing because my idea, all three of us have a different idea of what equality is. And so you start to get into different perceptions, but I'd like to make things more equal somehow. And I don't know how to do that, but I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I think equality sometimes does get to be a tricky word because I know for myself, like I don't want everything to be the same. I want things to be fair, and I want things to, I don't want harm onto anybody. But yeah, like I like to go to the African dance because I like diversity. I like learning about things that are different from me. And I think within equality is also celebrating diversity and how we're all different.
I'll say something in there, which it's about myself too, which is that what I've learned, I played in gospel choir. I was the only white guy in gospel choir as a kid. I played in jazz bands. I was really involved with different cultures. And what I never realized until Black Lives Matter is I had the privilege to do all that. I had the privilege, and I'm not calling you out, Nikki. I agree with you, but it's like you have the privilege to go to these dance things. But people of different races and different colors don't always get the privilege to do that. And I'll just share that because I learned that recently.
Sometimes we don't. Sometimes also, I mean, I'm not interested. My mama would say I was raised right, so I'm not interested in denigrating folks. But what I would say is that also sometimes we don't prefer to have the kind of diversity that other folks prefer. It's something that it's not that, oh, I'd want to be closed off so much as it is there are certain coping mechanisms given the history of Blackness in the West or the history of anti-Blackness in the West, that sometimes what makes most sense to me, to us, to folks who I care about and love, is to actually just move deeper into Blackness itself, right? Not right to sort of say, look, we're gonna stay here, and we're gonna stay here in a way that opens up possibilities for us to find refuge, to find care, to find possibilities. I say that to say I'm thinking of because I can't get her off my mind. I'm thinking of Toni Morrison. She has a whole bunch of books out. She has a novel called Beloved, and she takes this scene that's called The Clearing, and she says the character who's in the clearing is a preacher, Black woman who couldn't read, but she says, here in this here place we flesh that weeps and laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. And I won't give the whole rest of the sermon that I may or may not have memorized, but what I will say is that what she's getting at there is that ultimately, even for those of us who are Black, who fall under the sign of Blackness, for many of us, as lofty as equality sounds, and even as maybe, pleasant as diversity sounds, I'll be frank, I'll just speak for myself here. It's neither something that I think is possible nor something that I've even come to prefer. What I've really come to prefer is clearing space for flesh to be loved, for Black flesh to be loved, for Black flesh to love and to be loved. And I keep using that word because that becomes, for me, that becomes the ethical litmus test. Can you love Black flesh? That becomes the ethical litmus test for anybody, Black, non-Black, otherwise. Can you love Black flesh? Can you see Black movement in the streets and not, I don't know, tisk or make subtle distinctions between rioters and looters and peaceful protesters? Can you see Black flesh moving in the streets and say, I love that? Can you do it? I mean, and that's not like a question I'm putting to both of you. I'm saying that becomes, for me, the ethical litmus test. And that doesn't mean that white people cannot do that. What it means is that most white people I've come in contact with find it incredibly difficult to do so, because that requires a level of risk, a level of engagement that would significantly change and alter their lives, and not for the better. Right. I mean, that becomes the question. How, and even for someone like myself, who's a professor now, I mean, back in the day when I was in the streets organizing, yeah, it was different. It was like, oh yeah, Black Lives Matter. Now, I'm at a pretty good school and have a pretty good job. And so I continued this work under the risk that I know that at the end of the day, if I love Black flesh, this could and probably will cost me something. So that's my way of responding to part of what you were getting at.
Yeah, I'm going to share a story. And the word flesh, I was teaching in Austria, and I don't speak German. And I said the word Fleisch because I thought Fleisch is like flesh. And it turns out flesh is only the meat that you eat. So you would never really say flesh as far as the human. So when I hear flesh, and I'm hearing black flesh, I'm personally going to like not a good place necessarily, being hunted, which I can love because not the hunting, but of a human being being hunted is painful for me. But there was something in that made me think of, so I grew up in it was a mixed middle class, middle, upper, lower mixture about everything. Pretty white town. We brought people in from Boston, and I was friends with people wherever. And then time happens and you lose track with people. And then after Black Lives Matter, I started reconnecting. I had a friend who I reconnected with because I cared about her, and this was a chance to reconnect. And I did love her flesh. That if she's listening, I don't mean it in that way. And please, I hope your husband doesn't hear that in any other way. But I did love her as a person. She's marvelous. But there's been a part of me that's saying, isn't this racist that I'm reaching out to you now because you're Black? I'm now creating this barrier. I mean, the benefit is, yes, we're connecting and we're reconnecting after 20 years, and that's great. And we're having so many fun stories. And you know, she has Caribbean roots, and she's going to cook me some of her Caribbean food because I love that sort of stuff. I'm down for some oxtail curry whenever I can get it. But the fact that the impetus was not necessarily that I saw her as a person, it was I saw her as someone struggling right now in this. And I guess for me, I'm struggling a bit of saying, like, is that not racist? Is there not a sense of still seeing the person as a color instead of a person?
I would say it's anti-Black, not so much that it's racist. I don't think of, I'm not really interested in. Again, that's not a moral indictment. I really want us to say, if the one thing that I wish I could disabuse white people of is understanding race as a moral problem. It's not. It's an ethical one. It's a philosophical one. It shouldn't instill shame. It should actually invoke responsibility. I would also say, again, this is why I say I'm not interested in assessing blame or placing fault in particular places. So I'll say two things to keep my comments coherent or like ordered for your audience. First thing I'll say in terms of what you just mentioned is it's anti-Black, but it's anti-Black for what I understand as religious purposes. You reached out to her because Black flesh died. In other words, in other words, you derive the benefit from the death of a Black person. If you know Christianity, you know that is actually the structure of salvation for Christianity itself, is to derive a metaphysical benefit from the death of another. In other words, the salve, the healing comes off is because the violence has been displaced on somebody else. This is usually how anti-Blackness works in this country. So let's move away from you, Andrew, and move toward Joe Biden, who's easier to pick on because he's a presidential candidate, and because he's responsible for this. So in his acceptance speech, he mentions Gianna Floyd, George Floyd's daughter, and he says, well, she came up to me and told me my daddy changed the world. And I have no qualms with the young girl saying that she's trying to process a profound loss. What I have a problem with, what we should all have a problem with, is us turning George Floyd into an unwilling martyr and into a sort of an unwilling sacrifice for justice. The better thing that should have happened is that he should be alive, that he shouldn't have had to change the world, because George Floyd never wanted to change the world. But the country derives a benefit from him dying. It gets to cleanse its conscience. It gets to say, we reformed the police. We've done something good. It gets to receive salvation on the basis of that. That's not necessarily on the basis of people's particular intentions. So that's the first point I want to make, is that what you're feeling in terms of conviction is a larger religious structure of atonement that the country cannot shake. We kill Black people because we need to feel better about ourselves. That's how it works. That's the first thing. The second thing that I'll say, and something that's curious to me, is that I see color all the time, and I see people. So I see you all as white, and that neither. In other words, there's not a bifurcation between color and humanity for me. So it's not that I don't see color. It's that I see people who have color, right? And it's that I see those histories that are wedded to that particular color symbolism. That doesn't, and I also want to be clear here, this doesn't preclude me from having very intimate relationships with white people. One of my closest friends, and I'm going to sound like the white liberal who says, "Oh, I've got a black friend," but I mean it. And one of my closest friends is a white person, and I love him to death, absolutely do. And my teacher is a Japanese woman. The woman who formed me, who made me a PhD, who busted my ass for years. I was writing my dissertation. Little short Japanese woman who was rigorous as hell and who loved me enough to not give me a pass because I was black. And so she did this incredible work. And so I say all of that to say that those folks have invested in me. They have loved my black flesh as black flesh. I love how you say, this is the third thing I'll say, I love that flesh is animal meat, right? I really do. It's brutal for everyone on this call, but it also materializes and actually lays bare the profound joy and sorrow of blackness in the West. Because on the one hand, animal meat is not actually an individual flesh is something that just flows. It's just connection. We make distinctions between, oh, these are the ribs or whatever the hell, but it's really just part of an organism. So there's always this open movement. It's organic connection that flesh is. So meat works. The other part about it is that meat also invites consumption. And so you're absolutely right on the converse side too. And that's part of the game. So I love that. So one, yes, absolutely, it's religious. Two, you can get past this, or maybe I don't know if you can. I don't know how it works, but loving black flesh is a way to go. And then number three, yeah, flesh is this odd conflation of consumption and sociality.
I will say that the second when you first got on and I saw your big smile, I fell in love with your black flesh. You're the people won't see because we only record the audio, but you have such an embodied presence. Actually, when you come on, who you are comes out so much. Of course, we're interacting through this Zoom medium, but even right now, your smile, which is just infectious, it shines through. It's interesting to me because you are such an embodied person, yet you speak about maybe having places of not having a place to be, which makes me want to come back around to the beginning before we run out of time, which we probably will, which is what can be done? Maybe it's not because I know that's also the big white thing. When Black Lives Matter came on, I made a post saying any friends of mine who have African roots or black roots or whatever wording I used at that time, that was probably incorrect. I said, please let me know. And I'm happy to offer free meditation, or offer free whatever. And someone was like, oh yeah, white person thinking you can just step on in and make things. And I was like, that's not my intent. But that being said, what can we as in humanity, not just Nikki and I, two white people stepping in as white people, but what can we start to do to make a change, to add for embodiment, to add for movement practices, to add for body work, to go forward with that? I know you mentioned a little bit before.
I mean, it's always. I mean, I wish I had an answer to this question. I tell people not so tongue in cheekly that if I had an answer to this particular question, I would be a trillionaire. I'd be richer than Jeff Bezos. I would be loaded. But what I can say though is that I'll break it down into a few things. One, I think recognition is necessary. And what I mean by that is recognizing that what we want to call injustice is actually its opposite. It's good. We have to recognize that what's happening to Black people is sanctioned. It is important. And if this world is to continue the way that it does, we have to recognize that it will continue to happen. Change, the transformation that we're asking for, that folks like myself are asking for, require nothing less than the dissolution of this world and the creation of another one. That's not me trying to be radical. That's not me saying, ooh, I'm just, burn everything down. It's just that we've tried everything under the sun, and we're still in the same position. That's the first thing. The second thing that I'll say is that it requires risk. I can't tell you what that risk means for folks who are white, because I live risk. I live it all the time, so I don't know what it's like to voluntarily incur risk what I can say is that whatever that looks like, loving Black flesh is risky. That's all I can say. There's a woman in this narrative that I was talking about in Beloved. There's this white girl. Her name is Amy Denver. And the main character of the book is running away to freedom. She's an enslaved Black woman who's running away, but she has to deliver. She had just delivered this baby, but she had run away. And before she'd run away, her master had beat her brutally. And Amy Denver was called her all types of horrible things, but at the end of the day took responsibility for this Black woman and took care of her, nursed her back to health so that she could run further to freedom. Her name was in the book, her name is Amy Denver, and Setha, the protagonist, names her daughter Denver in honor of this white girl. Not because this white girl is a hero or a heroine or a savior, but because she was ethical and she took a risk. She did that thing and moved on. So there's risky work that is connected to this. So I would say assess your risk and then take it on. That's the next thing. I think the third thing is one of the things that the Western world struggles with is its allegiance to a Christian narrative, even when people aren't Christian. I'm not Christian enough for Christians, but I'm too Christian for atheists, if that makes sense. So like, you know, there's too much Buddha in the way that I move and not enough, like all of this to say, even though we don't like to call ourselves Christians in the West, or some of us don't call ourselves Christians in the West, what happens is that Christianity structures our ethics. And what I'm trying to point out here is that on the one hand, we can talk about anti-Blackness as an atonement theory of salvation, which is what I was talking about. The West needs Black people as sacrificial matter to save itself. The other side of this, though, is what we like to call white savior narratives. And the problem with white savior narratives is not that white people are out here trying to do the work. The problem is that white people are out here doing the work and demanding that we give them credit for it. So, and this in my mind goes back to a Christological logic that Jesus requires that we glorify him in the wake of his death as he resurrects and transfigures, right? It's important that we do that. And so white people ask us to do the same thing for them when they show up in the streets with us. Oh, we're marching for you. Yes, you are. That's the end. There's not necessarily a thank you involved in that. There is only the sociality that erupts in that moment, and then we move forward.
Totally. I mean, that is what I saw. I mean, it's a struggle with me. I don't really care about getting recognition, but I process a lot through vocab. So like a lot of times I'll talk about something and it's not about getting recognition, it's just how I process. But as this whole movement's this whole movement's been going for a while, but as it sort of broke out again around George Floyd, watching my yoga narratives of white women, exactly like you said, and I was just like, there was something missing within it. And I think I don't fully agree with a lot of what Ibram Kendi says. It didn't. I mentioned earlier, I follow a little more about Glenn Loury and other Black intellectual narratives and maybe it's because they reinforce my beliefs, but I think it's because they take bigger pictures at hand. But I was watching a lot of people talk about white fragility, which is it's great, but they're sort of doing it being like, look at me. And it's like, it's not about you though. It's not about you at all. So struggling within this sort of thing, maybe I'm missing something, along the way. And then luckily hearing people like you and being like, oh, okay, no, I'm not fully missing it. I've got some stuff I'm missing, but okay, yeah.
All I'll add here is, I know we're coming up on time. All I'll add here is that there's a reason why Ibram Kendi is as loaded as he is at this point, is as well recognized. There's a reason why Robin DiAngelo, for better or for worse, is a millionaire. And it has a lot to do because those two authors, and I think it actually has nothing to do with their intentions. I think they are well-intentioned as hell. And this will probably transition me to my last point, but what's happening is that what they're doing, the text that they're writing, so Stand from the Beginning is not that bad. It's the How to Be an Anti-Racist text from Kendi that raises questions. And White Fragility is also a difficult text too. But the problem with both of those texts is that they make people feel good in the process. They assuage a certain kind of prophetic honesty.
But
right?
they also there's this thing about, well, if you're not with us, you prove our point. There's this whole catch-22 built
Right.
into it as well. Yeah.
Right. You're absolutely correct. And I think at the end of the day, you're dealing with, you're dealing with a group of folks who are on the one hand assuaging a large swath of people, but then on the other hand, being absolutist about their disposition to assuage a large swath of folks. And so they would say the proof is in the pudding. White people are changing. They're advocating for different policies. But my question to Kendi, not so much D'Angelo. I don't really know how to process her yet. But my question to Kendi is let's say we shift the policy. So cops put their knee on my back instead of my throat now. I mean, what's the difference? Like I'm still going to feel, oh, I didn't die, but my back is bruised. I mean, Freddie Gray died in the back of a paddy wagon. They didn't choke him out. He just happened to be cuffed, and they gave him what they call a quote unquote rough ride. We have things on the books now that are meant to stop some of this stuff, policies that are meant to quit this. And so I totally agree with you that, yeah, they reinforce that. This takes me to the next point, and this exceeds it exceeds their intentions. The other thing that I would say that we can do, and this is something that's very difficult even for me, is we have to stop thinking of people as bodies housing souls. What do I mean by that? I don't mean that in the sense that we don't have souls. I don't know. I'll figure out when I die what goes down, right? Astral projection's one thing, a soul is another thing, right? I'm that but my point in all of this is that when we think about bodies, when we think about ourselves as bodies having souls, we immediately go to the question of intention and motivation. That's how the criminal justice system is set up. Well, what was their intent? What was your intent when you did harm? And as soon as we do that, as soon as we produce a soul, we actually produce a legal soul. We produce the possibility of absolving some people who have done some heinous things. And we produce the possibility of absolving them of the violence that they've committed. I'm not interested in motivations. I'm interested, as my partner tells me all the time, she said, I don't know what you mean. I know what you said. I don't know what you mean. I know what you did. Right. And we joke all of it, but that's what it comes down to. And we have to address that harm. Right. We have to address that harm. And for me, that actually doesn't require punishment. I mean, like, I'm not interested in people like, oh, arrest the cops that killed Breonna Taylor. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm actually interested in why can we find a world where we don't need cops to be doing anything like SWAT team work in the first place? What were the conditions that allowed for them to show up? That's the question. How do we eliminate the capacity for them to exist in the first place? That's a better question to ask. So I say all that to say, like, let's move beyond the production of a soul and move into how do we create actions and structures that abolish the necessity for some of these punitive structures. And I think, honestly, bodywork's part of that. I'll finish with this. One of my, not guilty, one of my scariest attractions is an image of Thich Kong Duk. I don't know if you all know who he is. He's a Buddhist monk who was protesting the oppression of Buddhists. I believe it was in Vietnam.
The one who did self-immolation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And what strikes me about that, I don't know if you all have watched the video. I've watched the video way too many times. But if you watch it, everyone else is bawling, right? I mean, all the monks they're losing their shit. Forgive me. They are crying. They are losing it. But if you watch him, he's so in his body that he's just calm. Because he knew what he was doing. And it shows in that moment what happens. For me, I don't know how to see it for anyone else, but for me, what that shows me is he wasn't interested in being a savior. He wasn't interested in being anybody's like sacrifice. What he was doing was showing, as brutal as it was, he was making clear the violence that was showing up throughout that country already. But he was in his body when he did it. So he was able, in a way that none of us on the West that I know was able to bear that brutality because he was acutely aware. He was grounded. So I think body work allows for that kind of grounding, that kind of awareness, that kind of clear-sightedness to say, look, here's where we are. Here's what we got to do. Here's where the risks are going to happen. We have to be ready for it. So those are my thoughts. I don't know. That was a lot, but yeah, those are my thoughts in terms of this.
No, it's great.
I think as you've been talking, especially about the body and everything, it really brings up somatic practices. Somatic is about being in your body, feeling yourself. And I think, I mean, you've shared so many wonderful things. I'm still kind of just digesting it, but I think, and it's, you know, I'm going to say it, and I'm still kind of holding that contemplation of like, so many people had to be sacrificed. So many people had to die for people. I mean, the Black Lives Movement, you know, what the atrocious things that were happening in the States, it is a little mind blowing how that was being represented in, you know, across the world, where everybody globally started marching. And in that, maybe there were some people that were kind of looking for their humanitarian trophy of like, oh, look, I'm out there marching. But I think overall, though, coming into the place of to deeply love, to love skin, Black skin, for some people, it's not going to be love at first sight. There has to be conversation. There has to be rapport. And I think that's kind of what's happening is people are, especially white people, are starting to recognize that of their privileges and how it's unjust that other people, that we get it because of how we're born. And I mean, it's interesting because just a kind of a quick short story that happened fairly recently here in Boulder. It's pretty white. And we're at my neighborhood pool, and I'm talking to a woman, and she and her husband are professors. Somewhere in the southern states, and it's a prestigious school. Sorry, but they adopted a Black boy, and he's autistic, and he is kind of coming on to like preteen age, and they moved from the southern states to here because she was like, even in our nice neighborhood, their son was getting picked on. And she's like, I didn't feel safe for my son to be growing up there, because what are they going to think of a Black man wandering around the streets with him being autistic, not his actions kind of being unpredictable. She's like, he was already being spit on, name called. And it was just, when we were having this conversation, I grew up in the South, so there's some things that I could relate with. And it was just still shocking to hear how this happens to somebody, even though I'm very aware of what I'm seeing in the news, but to like, I'm not confronted with a lot of this because, again, I live in a very white community. We're all kind of walking in our white privilege. And then sitting there having this conversation with a mother that she's fearing the life of her child who's just walking around, living his life. And I don't have that fear necessarily for my two young kids. I have different fears of creepy pedophiles, but I'm not fearing that they're just going to get shot because of where they are and what they look like.
I think, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, there's so many thoughts rolling through my head right now. I think the first thing that I would say is it's not shocking. The story that you told is not shocking to me, but it's also not shocking to me that you're shocked, if that makes sense. Right. So it's.
Right. And I think that sorry to interrupt, but I think that's what's happening in this white recognition is that we're like, wow. Mm-hmm. Again, like I said, like embodying it in a totally different way instead of being like, oh, that's terrible news. And then going on along with their day, like really embodying and being like that is deeply wounding.
And all I can say, I mean, I wish I could. I don't even know how. I read a lot. I'll try to frame it this way. I have a couple of things that are going through my mind, but I'll frame it this way. I'm sitting in a chair right now, and This is an example I use with my students all the time. I call my students my babies, and they know that. So it is what it is. They're 18 to 22 years old too. So me calling them my babies, they're like, "Yo, this is ridiculous, Dr. Gray." But anyway, so I'm sitting in a chair right now, and the chair is designed to hold me up, right? It's just designed to do that. That's what it's designed to do. If this chair broke, I would be shocked, right? Because it's designed to hold me up. It's designed to hold my weight. It's designed to be here for me, be available for me. If the chair broke, I would freak out. Like, what happened? Why did the leg go? Right? That's the first thing. The other thing that would shock me is that the chair actually started talking to me and being like, "Bro, I'm sick of this shit. Like, you're heavy, right? Like, you can't, I'm tired. Like, I'm tired of holding this." And so what we're noticing right now metaphorically is that the chairs are either breaking in this country or they're saying, "I'm tired." And it's shocking for a lot of people because not because they're ill and they're malicious. This is like I'm not sitting in a chair like, "Hey, yo, this chair is horrible. Like, I'm just gonna mess its life up." No, it really is. I see a chair and I sit down. I do this, and this is just kind of the way that my day moves through the world. To make it a bit less abstract and a bit more closer to home, I know I got a job at I teach at Syracuse University, and I know some of the folks who applied for the job I have. Right, none of them are Black women, but some of them are women. And so for me, I go into this and I think to myself, well, I got this job because I'm a pretty smart guy and I talk pretty well and I'm pretty good at my job. I'm pretty good at teaching and research and all. And so it would be striking to me, right, if somebody was like, "Well, actually, there was a gender dynamic to it." If because initially I would have been like, "Well, I just the best person got the job." But the truth of the matter is that that's not necessarily the case. The most charismatic person got the job. The most how do I say, the person who radiates the most affect got the job. And oftentimes we read charisma in gender terms. So whereas what looks like passion and charisma for me shows up as such, for someone else who's passionate, it might show up otherwise. And so I shared that to say that part of what we have to do, and that's why I say recognition is so important. And you're right, I don't know how we bring people into that recognition. I don't know how because I'm not interested in massaging feelings. I'm not going to intentionally hurt your feelings, but I'm also not going to handhold you either. I'm going to say, look, we have work to do. You got to get with me or you don't. And it's okay if you don't get with me. I'm still going to care. The invitation is always going to be available. So I say all that to say that, like, for me, I don't know how we bring people into that so much as just to say, hey, chairs are talking back right now. They're literally saying, it's been heavy. You're heavy. I'm tired. And it sucks, and I'm tired. And what you're noticing, as is the case, if my chair started talking to me, I would probably throw this chair over and just throw it away. And we're seeing the same thing happen to people in the country.
If your chair was talking, I would keep that. I would put on the news. You'd be a trillionaire again. You'd be above Bezos. You'd be like, I got a talking chair, But no, we always say this, be respectful of your time. We are over. We have more time, but I do want to respect your time. So if you got to bounce, you got to bounce. But to say, how I hear what you're saying is belief systems. It comes down to that. You have a belief system that this chair will hold you. Your belief system does not have that it'll talk back, that it'll break. It's that it'll hold you. It might have that it'll break a little bit, so you kind of move yourself around a little bit, but you have a system in place, a perceptual belief system, and the same is for us. So prior to a year ago, our belief system was not that an autistic Black kid would be in trouble. It would not be that any of the other things that I've gone through that I've talked about before. It's not about me, so I don't have to keep talking about my own experiences. But now we're expanding our belief system. We're having that dialogue to sort of say, hey, the chair is talking back. The autistic Black kid is not safe. The George Floyd was not safe. Whatever there's thousands of things. And so I'm going to throw something out there that I experienced, I think yesterday or 2 days ago. I was working with a client who is of South Asian descent and actually is European by birth. And I had just been talking with a friend of mine about different race relation things. And it was the first time. So I was one of the people who would say I didn't see color. It wasn't that I didn't see color. It's that I didn't react to color. Obviously, I can see you're black, but I see people, right? Okay, that's a privilege. I get it. I was working with him, and it was the first time when he was of Indian descent. I could see he's brown skin. But I saw him and sort of said, well, what's the backstory there? What has this person gone through? Which I think should be for everyone. I don't think it should. I mean, clearly there's more going on, but it's not like I should only do it with people with darker color skin. I should be doing it with everyone. When a white person comes into me, you say, what's that backstory there? It's the whole thing. Every life does matter. Black lives matter a little more right now, that sort of thing. But does that narrative of, okay, Biko Mandela Gray, which is the best effing name. I mean, it's like your parents were like, this guy is going to be a fighter. Steve Biko and Nelson Mandela. I mean, I'm sure there's someone famous Gray, but we'll leave those out for now. But like, is that, I guess, in a way, does that also then make it racial profiling? When I come in and Biko comes to see me and I'm like, I'm seeing you, but I'm also seeing the fact that your presumably ancestors came over on slave ships at some point. I mean, obviously nowadays, Black African-American might not actually be slavery American. It may be like, I'm from Nigeria. My parents moved here a year ago. It's changed a lot, but bringing that in, does that not also bring a sense of profiling, although it's in a good way, right? It's still like, and I'm asking, I think, for myself, but also for other people who are trying to make change and to see and to make a greater world while still not creating this bigger, what's the word, like not dichotomy, but a split of sorts. Or was I doing a good thing? I don't know.
I mean, so we're gonna get in the weeds here, if you all don't mind for a second. I'm trained in a specific kind of philosophy, and it's a specific kind of it's a specific kind of philosophical tradition that's about experience. The fancy word for it is phenomenology, but phenomenology is...
Yeah, I'm reading a book on Merleau-Ponty right now.
Then you're going to be fine or somewhat fine with what's about to come out of my mouth. Many people, particularly people in spiritual circles, have gotten the word phenomenology, and I mean something very different by it, because aside from folks like you who've read Merleau-Ponty, we typically think of phenomenology as a kind of like spiritual ascent work. And yes to that, but that's not what I'm doing. One of the philosophers who I read was a Jewish man who lost his entire family during the Nazi Holocaust. His name was Emanuel Levinas. His teacher, ironically enough, was Martin Heidegger, who was a Nazi. And Emanuel Levinas makes a particular claim, a very specific one that I think, even as I am critical of some of his other work, a claim that I find to be useful in moments like this, when people are wondering about perception and lenses and seeing skin color and questions of profiling. Levinas puts it this way: if you see something that is brown and tall and green, and it has these things poking out of it that are green, and it has these things that are going deep into the ground, if you name that thing as a tree, you've already done violence to it, because you've developed a category for it on the basis of your own perception. I say that to say it doesn't mean that violence is not always present or not always necessary. Sometimes it is. I mean, we wouldn't be able to communicate if we didn't have words. And so in a certain way, the violence of linguistic constraint is a perpetual threat. It just is what it is. What you can do is try your best, as he says, to let the otherness of the other shine through. And what that means for him is being hospitable to the other. This is where it gets risky, right? This is where things get risky, because for Levinas, that hospitality, he calls it being held hostage by the other. That hospitality is absolute for him. I'm not with him on that, because I'm sorry, I can't let everybody in my house. But his point in all of this is that conceptually, perceptually, in terms of our belief systems, we have predetermined categories that we use to determine the meaning of a life. We do it all the time. I don't mean this in an implicit bias way. That's not what I'm getting at right now. I'm not interested in, ooh, everybody's racist. I don't care about that conversation. What I'm pointing out here is that there are categorical structures that literally govern the way that we see the world. And what Levinas says is that there's one thing that shows up in the world that actually disrupts those categories, and that is the face of another. The face of another person, another animal, whatever, of an other. Because the face exceeds meaning, right? That's the thing that is so important here. And so if you assign a meaning to an expression on a face, if you look at my face and assume that I'm angry, and I've never given you, and all I've done is I might have wrinkles in my forehead or whatever the case may be, then what happens is that you've now done categorical violence to me. The death's already, all you gotta do at that point is just pull the trigger. So if you look at people like Timothy Loman, I keep coming back to him, what he saw was 5'8", black skin, 185 pounds. He knows that means black man. Couple that with the 911 call that says this person might have a gun. And you've already have a categorical structure of perception that says this person's a threat, he has to go. This is not something you think through. This is something that happens because he doesn't have to think about it. My point in this is to say that what I would encourage your listeners to think about is not trying to disabuse themselves of seeing color. Not saying they see people first and color second, or they see people with at what point in time I would suggest people move away from trying to ascertain the meaning of the person who's next to them, who is coming in front of them. Let them talk to you. Embrace the language. Embrace the conversation. Embrace the discourse. Embrace the way that they speak to you. Not just in terms of the words itself, but literally embrace the fact that embrace the fact that they may say, I don't want to talk. Be vulnerable enough to allow, irrespective, and this is the ethical move here, irrespective of one's own proclivities, presuppositions. Hey, not even what do you need, just hey. That's all I got. I mean, that's how I think. I mean, honestly, that's how I think about it. So yeah.
Yeah, I really feel like that is such a good place to really just leave it almost. Not even almost, it is. Everything was great, but that last part really, I think, was what I was looking for. Not just because of getting really into phenomenology and you ticked off my list, but I also just need to really absorb all that. There's just, luckily in a few days I'm going to go through and edit everything and get to hear it again. I need a like a nap right now. Just to like.
It's totally fair. I forgive me for it. My students.
No, it's perfect. I mean, that's the reason when I heard you and I said, this is what I want to hear. This is what I need to learn. And this is what I want to share. More importantly, this is what I want to share. I want people to hear this because I think it needs to be heard. It needs to be shared. It needs to be heard.
Well, in that last bit, I mean, I know we were kind of staying focused on Black Lives Matter, but that is, and I don't know this thing of phenomenology. It's new to me. I know I've heard Andrew talk about it a little bit, but I couldn't help just starting, like my brain was going through all these different slides of like how this should be like a worldview of everything in a way of, again, taking a moment. And of course we do need to define things to have, like you already kind of said that, but to really allow life to come to you before you start going after it with projections and stories and beliefs, and like let a being, regardless of what their color is, their culture, gender, and just be open to the dialogue that can come without any kind of preconceived ideas. And I think, in a way, like in Rolfing, in the particular type of work, there's a lot of training with students to teach somebody how to do body reading of course, we're looking for looking for imbalances and things like that. But to be able to really do that and to see the whole body, there's something in the focus where it really is taking time to allow the whole body to come to you and not be so laser focused on like their imperfections, and also appreciating like, all right, they may walk differently, but is there still function? You mean someone who's scoliosis will walk funny, but they can still have great function. So you're not defining somebody on a structure, essentially. Taking it to what a picture book, anatomy book, has us all like perfectly stacked. But that's not really how bodies are.
But I think I also, like when I saw you, and I mentioned this earlier, I said, anyone who sees you can see this smiling, happy person, flesh, that I think there is a sense of communication, like, is that you are allowing yourself to be seen that way. So there is a communication partly within that, although there still is a judgment on my part, or whether it's implicit or not, of like, oh, this looks what I see. This looks like a loving, happy person to me based on my experiences. And I get you still have to let that come out. Although there is a sense of, I cannot talk to you and show you different expressions and have communication within that. There's someone you actually might be interested in. He was a Rolfer, which is what Nikki and I both studied. And he was a professor of philosophy at Purdue years ago, who had a life-changing Rolfing experience, became a Rolfer himself, and writes books on somatic ontology and really interesting stuff. That's what piqued my interest into this, to go into it. And it may be interesting as well to explore.
Tell him his name. You haven't said
his name. Oh, yeah, his name's Jeff Maitland. But the thing I was going to say going on, we talk about Christianity, and for sure, I mean, again, growing up Jewish, I still recognize there's a Judeo-Christian world that we live in. And even though I spend a lot of time in Asia and get Buddhist principles and all that sort of stuff, I think the reason what has to do more as far as why we don't think in the way, like Nikki was saying, why don't we think in this way, it has to do with Descartes. It has to do with the fact of the separation of body and mind, and a lot of that Cartesian logic, which is so unfortunately brought into our education and our schooling. And so if we really do want to start to change stuff, there's a lot to do, but also it's that education, and it's starting to see beyond Descartes. And I just learned, we all know I think therefore I am. I never knew that was a part of another proof, of which the second part of the proof is basically like, there's a devil behind me and the devil is making me do this. That is actually a part of the proof. I mean, Biko, you can talk more about that, which is just asinine. But what gets known is, I think therefore I am. Well, no, everything before that actually, that gets lost. I mean, you don't have to. We've already gotten way over time, which we're cool with. But part of the fact is, I don't love the word systemic because of what it can imply, but it's the systemic educational system that we're brought up to be with. And there has to be a shift. I don't have a good word, should have, again, words fail us. A shift in education in terms of lots of stuff. One being the bringing more phenomenology, understanding into our education would be a shift, because we wouldn't be seeing the same dualistic framework. I'll cut it off there because I'm going to keep going. But
no, and you don't have to apologize so much about words. I mean, that's both the joy and the brutality and the burden of words. I love words and I hate them at the same time, because they don't do what you want them to do, particularly when in prose. They just don't. Poetry is another story, but prose is just hard. What I was going to say was, just to respond very briefly to this, actually my dissertation, my first chapter, this all got gutted from the book version of the disc, but Descartes was central to it. The basic move here, you're absolutely right, is that Descartes is trying to find like certitude. He wants to be certain. He wants to make sure that he wants to know what truth is. And so he has to presume that nothing that he's seen up until that point, or nothing that the meditator in the meditations has seen up until that point, is false, right? So, if you go to sleep, you have dreams that feel real, right? If you hit the wrong LSD, or if you take too much LSD, things show themselves in very odd ways, right? And so, like, all of a sudden, perception is not something you can trust in terms of knowing things. And so he wants to presume, or the meditator presumes, hey, look, well, if I can't trust this, perhaps there's a demon on my shoulder that's messing with me, that's actually like making me not see things so then we have to ask the question, well, then what do we know? And the one thing that this meditator ends up saying is that what I know is that I'm thinking. Right? What I know is that I'm thinking. And so I think therefore I am has become like a weird mantra where people like tattoo it on their like self-help mantra, like, oh my God, if you just think yourself into it, you're gonna be it. That's not what Descartes meant at all. What he meant was, if I think, then I know I exist. Like, in other words, if I have a mind, I know I exist because my body will fail me. Right? If it's too hot outside, I might see a mirage. Right? And so what we did, you're right, in terms of education, what we ended up doing is bifurcating the person in general in that way, such that education became the structuring of the mind over and against, and the disciplining of the body, right? The structuring of the mind and the disciplining of the body over and against the embrace of the flesh, which is thinking, moving, doing all of these things. Once you split the mind from the flesh, it becomes very easy to make what we like to call racialized distinctions, right? That at the end of the day, this is why perhaps this might be why our current president loves to talk about his IQ, because intellect has been associated with a particular racialized and gendered subject, and embodiment has been associated with racialized and gendered subjects. So all of that to say that, yeah, I think therefore I am is not a mantra to be embraced, but instead a cautionary tale about what happens when somebody decides that they don't want to hear from anybody else. That's the first thing I'll say. Second thing, I'll just say this just briefly. This is probably more for your listeners than it is for you to. People are going to fail at this work. I fail at this work. Everyone fails at this work. Anyone who thinks that they're going to get it right, the majority of the time, is disillusioned, and they need to disabuse themselves of that. So moving forward, the question is not so much, what can we do? The question is, what happens when we fail? Do we stop there? What happens when I say the wrong thing? What happens when I do the wrong thing? What happens when I make the wrong decision, or the least effective or the least fruitful decision? Because that's where the work happens. And so, as Cornel West likes to say, you fail and then you fail better. You just keep failing better. And if I could just share that with your listeners, I guess as a final note, you're never going to get it right. I never get it right. None of us ever get it right. But the whole goal in this is to just continue to fail better. We messed up. Let's try again. We messed up. Let's try one more time. We messed up. We're going to try again. Right. And so I just want to encourage you all just to and your listeners to sit in that, no, don't get caught up in this paralyzing shame. That's not effective for anybody. And quite frankly, I will run away when I see white shame. I leave, I run, because I can't deal with it. I don't know how to handle that. I become an emotional mirror or an emotional garbage can at that point. And so I don't want to do that. So I fail and fail better. That's what I would let folks know.
Yeah, although I'm going to put one caveat there, and correct me if I'm wrong. It's not about getting it right, right? So that's the thing, is that we keep thinking it's right and wrong and keeping in that dualistic. So it's where your failing is right, and you're going to feel better next time, and that's going to be right. And it's just sort of changing that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Definitely. I mean, I'm glad you said it that way. I really appreciate you saying that way, that we think in terms of right and wrong, and in my mind, you're typically, what you're usually dealing with is better or worse, or more or less effective, more or less fruitful, as the Buddhists might say, right? And so how do we think about more fruitful action, more fruitful ways of engaging over and against these ways that we know will kill people? So yes. I wish I could stay on.
No, we're so thankful. We will, people can find you on Twitter. I'll share your information. Dr. Gray, thank you so much. This has been awesome. And I can't wait to share you with the world.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
I've had a blast. Y'all have a wonderful day, okay?
You too, sir.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Thank you for listening to us at Touching Into Presence. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can find out more about Dr. Gray at twitter.com/Biko Mandela Gray. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate it if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast and subscribe to it through the platform of your choice. When you do this, it really helps other people find us, and we greatly appreciate your support. We look forward to hearing back from you and seeing you on our next conversation at Touching into Presence. Bye-bye.